Hi everyone, this is Catherine from Cinemetrics Technologies. Welcome to our webinar on Zeem Security. During this webinar, we are going to discuss what hackers are looking for. We will have a Q&A section at the end of this webinar, so if you can, please hold your questions. When the time comes, you can write them in the chat and we will answer them. I'm now going to turn this over to our lead tech, Imran.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome everyone to our second webinar. So today we're going to discuss about what hackers are looking for and what you can do within Zeems so that they can get through. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and forth between a PDF document that I exported from PowerPoint, so it has slides, and then we're going to I'm going to switch back and forth between the actual Zeems interface and this PDF document. So today's agenda is, what hackers are looking for, how you can track suspicious activities in Zeems, what can you do to minimize the risks, and then at the end we're going to talk about some new features that will be released probably in mid-August. And we're gonna, right now I'm gonna be connecting to a newer version of Zeem, so you'll see a little bit of that. And then towards the end, I'll answer any questions that you have. Again, please post questions in the chat window, and then I'll answer them towards the end. Okay, so what are hackers looking for? The most important thing from a hacker's perspective is usually a user ID and password. So they're always looking to crack somebody's user ID and password, because once they get a user ID and password, they can use that information somewhere else. So for example, if they are able to, get a user ID and password, the next thing they're going to find out is if there's an RDP port open against your server, either against the same server or somewhere closer to that server. So maybe that entire subnet that you have. And if they find an RDP port, they already have a user ID and password, and they can basically come into your system. So most of the time they're looking for a user ID and password. Now there are different doors, and you have to make sure that every door is secure. So there are different doors that they can come in. The most important door is SMTP. And of course, there's an HTTP, IMAP, and POP3. And basically, all these are TCP/IP servers within Zeems. And so right now, we're talking just about Zeems, but these doors are there in any TCP/IP server. So if you have an FTP server, you have to make sure that the FTP server is also secure. But basically, what they're doing is they're trying to hack in through those servers and see if they can crack a user ID and password. Now, what do they do after they crack a user ID and password? They can send a lot of junk messages through your server, because once they find out the user and password, they can use SMTP authentication. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Another thing they can do is, like I said, if they have access to an RDP port, they can try the user ID credentials in that RDP port and get into your your server using the remote desktop, and that's obviously going to be disastrous, right? Another thing they can do is they can deliver viruses, because a lot of times what happens, particularly in these days, that all the people who are basically spamming, they try not to use their own servers. They try to find servers on the internet that are vulnerable to hacking, and they basically get control of somebody else's server. They put the virus on that server, and then it gets distributed from there onwards. So that's what they're looking for. Okay, so cracking password is probably the most important thing that you should take care of. Once they crack a password, it's like hitting a home run. Now, what can we do in Zeems to make sure that all these things don't happen? In Zeems, there's something called Intrusion Detection Log. So I'm going to switch back here, and up here under Tools, you can go to Intrusion Detection, and it's going to tell you the Intrusion Detection Log. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Then there are SMTP conversation.logs. So you can go here, Tool, View Logs, and there are a whole bunch of logs here. And the two most important, actually, probably this one is more important than the other. It's this SMTP conversation.log. The SMTP proxy conversation is also important, but I think this is probably more important. I'll talk about that why. You can set up alerts in Zeem, so you can go under server configuration and then manage alerts and make sure that your alerts are set up correctly. Then another thing that we've added recently, it's called the connection versus email ratio. That is currently not publicly available, but the version of Zeem that I'm using, it is available here. So there is this graph right here, which is, and I'm going to talk about this graph in a later slide. So this is a new feature that we've added. So what can you do to avoid this? The first thing that we recommend, in fact, we've started to recommend now, is that you don't use the SMTP proxy server. In fact, towards the end of this year, we will be deprecating the proxy server, and we will be asking every user who's using the proxy server to switch from proxy to the regular SMTP server. And I'll tell you exactly why we want people to do that. So hopefully by end of this year, nobody should be using the proxy server. I mean, we're going to leave the proxy server still running inside Zeem just for backwards compatibility, but we don't want anybody using that server because there are some security issues with that. So for example, when you use a proxy server, let's assume that this is a sender on the internet, and that sender is trying to send an email to an Exchange server within your LAN. And in the middle is Zeem's, and Zeem's, all it does is basically watches what goes. So when the sender sends hello, Zeem's simply sends that hello to Exchange. When the sender sends mail from, Zeem's is going to send that mail from to Exchange, and so on and so forth, except for the data command. The data command, Zeem's holds it, and it looks if the data, because data is the actual payload of the email. So it checks the email. If it's good, it lets it go. If it's bad, it blocks it. The most important thing in the proxy is this last part, this invalid. So what happens is that if the sender sends anything that Zeem's does not understand, it does not have to understand because it's only going to let whatever it sends it to Exchange. So the problem comes when somebody is trying to send the SMTP authentication command to Exchange, because what somebody can do from the internet is check what Exchange supports. So let's say it supports NTLM or whatever it supports. Somebody on the internet can send a user ID and password to your Exchange through Zeem's when you're using the proxy server. So if somebody's trying to crack a password, Zeem's won't even know that somebody's trying to do that, because for example, if they're using some encryption or any mechanism that Zeem's cannot understand, Zeem's won't know that they're trying to crack a password. And that is the reason why we will be deprecating this proxy server. Okay. So this is what happens. This is something that we will be, from now onwards, we will be recommending everybody to switch from proxy to the regular SMTP server. So when you are using the regular SMTP server, one thing that we have to monitor is who is able to relay. There are two conditions where Zeem's or any SMTP server is going to allow relaying. The first is authenticated users. So if the user is authenticated, the SMTP server is going to say, okay, fine, I'm going to let you relay. By the way, if somebody does not know what exactly is SMTP relaying, We have a nice article. So I think in my last webinar, I said, hey, Google is an excellent tool to search. So all you do is you go, put Zeems is followed by your question. So what is SMTP relay? And Google's going to most likely give you the page on our website that talks about what is SMTP relay. I strongly recommend you read this page if you are not sure what we mean by SMTP relay. So coming back to our talk, there are two conditions where the relay is going to occur. Either the user is authenticated or the IP address is allowed to relay. So let's take a look at the first condition. In this particular case, the blue line is a user trying to send an email from inside to somebody on the internet. The red line is somebody on the internet trying to send an email to a local user in Zeems. Another concept that I'd like to mention is the input and output of an SMTP server. Every SMTP server, regardless if it's Zeems or Exchange or whatever it is, has an input and an output. It always receives an email from input, and the input can, a local user can send it to the input, or a foreign user sends it to the input. Another thing that is very important to keep in mind is that the logs that you get in Zeems, so if I go to view logs, the logs that is related to the input of the SMTP server in Zeems is called the SMTP conversation.log. And the log that is associated with the output of Zeems is called the SMTP outbound conversation.log. So whenever somebody sends from the internet an email to an internal user, you will see the communication of that email in here. Once Zeems receives the email, it then forwards, let's say, to your Exchange server. You're going to see that communication in the SMTP outbound conversation. So when authentication is used, a local user, assuming Zeems is the only server in your system, a local user who's using either Outlook or Thunderbird, they will connect to the input of this SMTP server. Zeems is going to validate the user ID and password for that user. If the user is valid, Zeems is going to accept that email and then finally forward that email to whoever's supposed to get it. And that email could be somebody in, local, or somebody on the internet. Okay. All right, so that's the SMTP authentication part. Now, one thing that you don't want is somebody on the internet using SMTP authentication, because if somebody on the internet uses SMTP authentication, they can try all sorts of user ID and password until they hit a home run, right? So one thing that you could do is disable the SMTP authentication. Now, as far as the input goes, if you go to SMTP configuration, there are 3 ports for SMTP input. Port 25, and port 25 is the default port. Everybody's going to send you email on that port. There's a secondary port that you can put anything you want. A lot of people use 587, which is fine, but a more, because since you have the ability to tell your users the value for the secondary port, we recommend don't even use 587. Use something that is completely different, something that nobody will know except your users. And of course, this is the SSL port. Now, one very, very important thing that Zeems does is it has this checkbox right here. It says allow SMTP authentication, and when this box is not checked, Zeems will not accept authentication on port 25. It'll accept authentication on this port, secondary port, but not on the primary port. And that is very, very important, because if somebody on the internet is trying to hack in or try to guess a password, and Zeems doesn't even support that, even though they try to put the right combination of user ID and password, Zeams is not going to accept it. Another thing which is very important is in the new interface again, there is this graph that says SMTP connections versus email. So basically what this graph shows us is how many emails did you get and how many TCP/IP connections were made in the past. I believe this is like a few hours. I forget exactly the number of hours. But so if you see in this graph right here, I see here there were total 22 emails, but there were 35 connections. So obviously, where did these extra 13 connections come from? Meaning somebody connected to Zeams, but they didn't deliver email. So that's a question. Why did that happen? Now, if you see, this probably happened around 8:37 a.m. this morning. So what we can do is we can go here in the view logs. Again, I'm going to take a look at the SMTP conversation.log, and I'm going to search for this term, C followed by a space, 2 dashes, and a greater than sign, and then the word auth. Now, when I do this, it's going to list only the lines containing that, right? So why is somebody trying to use authentication? And this is a very good example. Somebody on the internet is trying to guess a password. So I'm going to just pick any number here, and I'm going to search for that particular number in the log. So if you see here, I see that somebody connected from this IP address. They send the hello. Now watch. Zeams, we have blocked Zeams to accept authentication on port 25, right? So in the result of the hello command, there is no verb for auth. Yet the sender who's connecting from that particular IP address tried to authenticate. And since the support is disabled in Zeams, Zeams responds, hey, this is a syntax error. I don't know what you mean by this. Even though this is a valid SMTP command, but Zeams said, hey, I'm not going to support it. By the way, in the log, any line that starts with C with a arrow going towards right means that the client sent that line, and the lines that starts or has an S with an arrow pointing to the left means Zeams replied to the command. So this was a command, this was Zeams reply, okay? Now, so this client sends an authentication, and Zeams said, hey, this is not supported at all. Why are you sending this to me? Now, if this box was checked, so watch, what I'm gonna do here is, actually, let me show you something. I have an email sender program. You can download this email sender program from our website, okay? I am going to try to send that email on port 25 using a valid account. So this is a valid, actually, account on that server, okay? I am going to send an email on port 25 with a valid user ID and password. And when I click, it's going to say, I'm not going to accept this email. So I get relaying denied because I'm trying to send an email to a non-local user. So the relaying was denied. Up here, there is no verb for authentication. So Zeams never accepted authentication. And since there was no authentication, I got the message relaying denied. Now, if I did the same thing on this other port, this one, it is going to accept my user ID and password and will try to relay the message. I'm not going to clear it. I'm just going to put a bunch of spaces here. Okay, so now I'm sending it to port 12500. There we go. So in this particular case, if you see the difference between this part right here, Zeams is saying, okay, I'm going to accept authentication, and the plain and the CRAM MD5 are the two mechanisms that it supports. So if you compare this with this, there's no authentication in here, but up here it supports it. And since the server supports authentication, the client has now the ability to support it too. So the client, the server says, by the way, besides authentication, I also support Start TLS. So this particular client, oops, what happened here? Okay, so this particular client supports authentication. So it supports encryption. So this connection is now encrypted. This part is not encrypted. And once we have established an encrypted channel, it is going to send the auth login. And then it sends the user ID and password. Eventually, Zeem says, okay, your user ID is successful. Go ahead and send it. We can look at the exact same log in here. So if I go back to Zeem's and I look at the SMTP conversation, where is it? There we go. Okay, and then I'm gonna again search for that C auth. Hopefully this is going to be the last one. Actually, well, there are two. The one is at 1220, the other one's 1221. Let's see which one's mine. See, somebody else. This guy is really bad. He's trying to hack in here. Okay, I'm gonna do it again. So hopefully this is my connection. There we go. So this is a log for the email that Zeem's accepted with authentication, and I can see that, you know, it was accepted. So we strongly recommend that if you don't need authentication, so again, coming back here, when do you need authentication? That's a question, right? If a user, an in-house user, needs to send an email to Zeem's that will be relayed to a foreign domain, whether it's Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo, or any other foreign domain, then you need SMTP authentication. So if this user is completely under your control, you can tell that user, hey, don't connect on port 25. Instead, connect on this other port number that we have opened up for you. Don't even use 587, because 587 is also a well-known port, and you will get a lot of attacks on 587 as well. So it's better to just use a port that won't get attacked. So now the question is, what if the bad guy even finds out about this port? You know, because they just fish for open ports, and they find, hey, you know what, 12500 is open. I'm going to see if an SMTP server is listening. In that case, there is an alert that you can set up. So if you go to manage alerts, this is the alert threshold. This means that if somebody tries to specify an incorrect password for more than 5 times, Zeem's is going to lock the IP address. Okay, so this is another mechanism that you can block. So hopefully nobody's going to find out about this weird port number, but if they do, there's another door that they have to go through, and that's that alert mechanism, because Zeem's is going to block that IP address. Okay, so coming back to this scenario, if your in-house users are completely under your control, block the authentication on port 25 and let the authentication go on that other SMTP port. Now, the second way of relaying is through the IP address. In this example, the local user connects, let's say, to an Exchange server. The Exchange server then forwards the message to Zeem's, and that eventually the message goes out to Gmail's user. In this case, SMTP authentication is completely out, meaning nobody uses SMTP authentication. And in that case, you can disable SMTP authentication even for the secondary port. The only thing is that option is not available through the GUI. It is available through the server.property. So if anybody's interested in blocking the secondary port, let us know. We'll tell you how to do that. Another thing that you could do is simply set this to -1, because if nobody is using the secondary SMTP port, you can simply set this to -1. You can have your Exchange connect on port 25, because when Exchange is forwarding messages to Zeems, it is not going to use authentication. You will have to specify Exchange's IP address among the relaying list, right? So authentication is completely out. And in that case, you can simply disable the second SMTP port. Leave this at 25 because you don't have a choice but to listen on 25. And then uncheck the allow SMTP authentication. Okay. So this is basically just reiterating what I just said. You should disable the SMTP authentication and then try listening on a different port. Now, when it comes to SMTP, you don't have a choice but to listen on 25, right? Because everybody on the internet will be connecting to port 25. But for every other server, you have a choice. You can have the web server of Zeem, change even 5272. You don't have to listen on 5272. You can change it to whatever port you want, whether, you just pick a number, right? And then let your users know about that number, so it's not a well-known port. Same goes with IMAP and POP. If you don't need the IMAP and POP, just disable them. Either disable them or block them from your firewall, so only your internal users can connect to either IMAP or POP. And again, in IMAP and POP, you can use SSL, so it gives you more flexibility. So this port changing is available for pretty much every other server but the SMTP, because SMTP, if you make your SMTP server listen on any other port but 25, you're not going to get any emails from the internet. Okay. All right. So again, same thing. Just reiterating, same thing. Don't use standard ports, and disable POP and IMAP, particularly if you're using it in hybrid or firewall mode. Another very common mistake that people make is when Zeems is running in either hybrid or firewall, even then the POP or the IMAP is enabled. When you have Zeems running in firewall mode or hybrid even, most likely nobody will be connecting to the IMAP or the POP server, because you don't want two repositories. One repository in your Exchange, another repository in Zeems, because then you end up creating two different independent repositories. A lot of people think that, oh, if my Exchange is going to go down, my users can connect to Zeems. Sure, they can connect, but since those repositories are completely independent, users will be downloading their emails from day one. So they will end up getting 10,000 emails all of a sudden if they now connect to Zeems IMAP server. So if your main repository is, let's say, downstream on Exchange or whichever email server you're using, we recommend disable the POP and the IMAP server. Because if you enable this and if you run it in hybrid mode, all you're doing is just wasting disk space and also opening up a door where a hacker can come in. So if you don't need it, just stop that. All right, so, okay. Another thing that you should watch, when somebody is authenticated and sends email, Zeems can keep a track of how many emails were sent from that user. Now, this is a test server, so we don't have real data on this, but there's a report here called authenticated messages. And what that does is it shows you how many emails were sent by a particular user. And if the number goes beyond a certain threshold, the administrator is going to get an email alert. So let's assume that if somebody somehow is able to crack a password and they are misusing that password to send, thousands of emails, the minute the number of messages for authenticated user goes beyond 50, the administrator is going to get an email. And then they can say, hey, why is this guy sending so many outbound emails? Okay, and then you will know something is wrong. So check this authenticated messages report once in a while. and make sure that this threshold is correctly set up. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some new features that are coming up. So if you see here, by the way, this is I'm using right now version 6.5. The current production version is 6.4, and that's what you guys are using right now. So in the new version, all the graphs have been updated. So if you hover your mouse over these graphs, it's a little bit more interactive. Every graph is updated. There are a couple more. This new top domain is one of them. This I just talked about. It shows you the ratio between emails and connection. If you click on this little button here, it's going to take you to our website, and it's going to show you what to look for if you see a graph that's completely different. So look at this. In this example, ideally, the green and the red lines should go together. Once in a while, you're going to see the red line go up a lot. So in this particular case, there are probably less than 20 emails, but the number of connections were close to 190. And obviously, somebody's trying to, figure out passwords here. As long as SMTP authentication is disabled, the bad guys can't do anything. Like I displayed, in the logs here, they're trying to find the key, but the lock does not exist. So even if they find the key and the lock doesn't exist, they won't be able to do anything. So so once you get this update, you will see the red spiking once or twice a day. As long as SMTP authentication is blocked, there won't be any problem. Okay, so then we've added 2 more reports in this section, the legal report section. There's a message catalog summary. What this does is, right now, again, there's very little data in this particular Zeem, so we don't have a very good sample. But basically, what this does is, from a legal perspective, if you want to know, 6 months ago, there was an ex-employee who was working for us, but he's no longer there. Who did he send emails right before leaving, or something like that, So you can specify a filter, you can specify a date, and it's going to give you, so let's say if I do, I'm going to do it without searching. So let's say if this were an employee, I would have searched for that employee. It would give us how many emails they got and so on and so forth. So that's one report. The other report is an attachment summary. If you run this report, it's going to give you the attachments that either came in or went out, who did it, and up here you can actually see the email. If I click here, it's going to display that particular email. So that's another, it shows the attachment size and so on and so forth. Again, same thing with searching. You could search for a particular attachment. So you could say, I want to know star.doc, and it'll show you just doc files, things like that. So that's another new email. Okay. So that's pretty much it. Now we're open for Q&A. I see that somebody has asked a question. Okay, is support available for how to decommission? Yes. So how do you decommission the SMTP server? Again, I'm going to go to Google, and I'm going to search Zeems, switch from SMTP proxy to regular. Okay. And Google does an excellent job of telling me the page. So this is the page on our website. It's going to help you. Basically, it's very, very simple. All you got to do is figure out, you see, the only difference actually in the proxy and the regular SMTP server is less configuration, right? In the proxy server, it's your exchange or whichever downstream server is. That's the server that decides if an incoming email is valid or invalid. So when somebody from gmail.com sends an email to johndoe@xyz.com, your exchange makes a decision either to accept or reject that email. That's the only pretty much difference from a functional perspective in proxy and the regular. So the benefit of proxy server is that you don't have to configure your domains within Zeams. If XYZ is your local domain, you don't have to tell Zeams, hey, XYZ is your local domain, because Zeams is not playing any role in accepting new emails. It's your exchange that's playing the role. So the only thing that you have to do is add the domain. So you go here in the SMTP configuration, you go to your domain tab, and whatever local domains you have, XYZ, ABC, whatever domains you have, you simply add those domains here. Then what you do is you go to the SMTP proxy configuration. Now, a lot of people, this is what we used to tell earlier, right? We used to tell them, hey, you know what? Create 2 IP addresses, one for inbound, the other one for outbound. If you only have one SMTP server, you only need 1 IP. So you'll also save 1 IP. So what you're going to do is you're going to disable the proxy server. That's the first thing you're going to do. The rest of the values doesn't matter, because if this is not checked, none of these will matter, right? So that's one thing you're going to have to do. The second thing that you do is you go to your SMTP configuration, you enter your domains here, and if you have multiple IP addresses, you just select all unassigned. Because then, regardless of how many, so for example, in this particular computer, I've got like, I don't know, 4 IPv4 and about 6 IPv6 addresses, right? So rather than binding to one particular one, I'm just going to say bind to all of them. So that's it. So it doesn't matter how many IP addresses you have on the computer, it's going to bind to all of them on port 25. And that is pretty much it. So the only problem that comes is when you have a lot of domains. So if you have like, 50, 60 domains, it's a little bit tedious because you're going to have to add all those domains here. But other than that, that's it. There's nothing much to set up. Okay. All right. We have another question here. Can you cluster 2 Zeams boxes in one site and use gslib to load balance the failure next EIPs? Okay. So we have again, go to Google, Zeams clustering, right? The first organic result is for cluster. This is how we recommend you cluster Zeams. Okay. Now, in this particular example, the actual server is Exchange. Now, this could be Zeams also. If this is Zeams, then this is your downstream server. Okay. These 3 servers are in the front. So when an email comes from the internet, they will come to these servers, and then these servers will filter and eventually distribute them to the final downstream server. So this could be Exchange, this could be another Zeams, it could be Postfix, you pick the server, right? But this is how we recommend you do the cluster. When you do the clustering, you're going to have one master, you're going to have multiple slaves, and you only deal with the master. Zeams is going to push or pull information from the slaves. So when you change a rule, if you want to view emails, everything you do on the master, and Zeams is in the background going to pull pretty much everything. Okay. All right. So yeah, it's still a single point of failure. Well, it's a single point of failure at this location, right, where the downstream server is. These servers are not. Now, there is a problem with clustering this downstream server. And the problem is with IMAP or POP. At least right now, there is no clustering for IMAP or POP. There is a clustering for SMTP, but not the user's repository. Clustering user repository, at least it's not in Zeams right now. I'm sure Exchange will probably have that feature, but Zeams does not have that feature. So there is a single point of failure at this location. If this dies, the slaves or the other masters will hold your email. So you won't lose any incoming email, but yes, you will need to bring up this machine, the one that has the POP and IMAP, as soon as possible, because nobody will be able to check their emails using either Outlook or Thunderbird. Now, again, if you have Exchange, and I think you can probably do IMAP clustering exchange. I haven't done it, so I'm not sure how that's done. But right now, that feature, at least for the IMAP and POP, is not available in the clustering. But for SMTP, definitely clustering is available. So if you're running Zeems in firewall or hybrid mode, absolutely, that's there. Okay. All right, so there's another question here that says how to secure web interface with SSL. Okay, that's very, very simple. What you do is you go to server configuration and you specify an SSL port. Now, when you specify the SSL port, this could be 443, 5273, whatever, and you save it, it is automatically going to download a self-signed certificate, and you're going to be up and running. The only problem with self-signed, so in fact, you know what, I can probably won't be able to connect because I haven't opened the port from the firewall. Let me see if I can connect. I don't think I'll be able to connect though, because the firewall port, the firewall port's not open. But if the port was open, I would be able to do this without doing anything else. I would see a warning message that says, "Hey, your certificate is not trusted." And in order to trust a certificate, what you do is you go to the SMTP configuration. Up here, you have to configure the SSL, okay? So you click here. Now, there are several options of configuring SSL. Option number one is automatically done for you, which is a self-sign. The problem with self-sign is that the users will get warning. So that's one problem. The other problem is that when you use start TLS on SMTP, depending upon who is sending you email, they may or may not like the fact that you're using a self-signed certificate. So on an email server, we strongly recommend not using a self-signed certificate. It's always better to purchase a certificate that is trusted, universally. Okay. Option number two is you create your own certificate. Option number three is that you import an existing certificate from an IIS server, or option number four, you import from an Apache server. Okay. In number 3 and number 4, there's a link here, click here for instructions, and same click here for instructions. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so another question is, so it's not really cluster, this is standard MX, that is correct. Yes, that is correct. That is the standard MX priority. The clustering part, when we say, so basically, let me connect to our production Zeems, okay? So we've got 2 Zeems. So this is our production Zeems, okay? And it is clustered. Hey, why is my password not coming up? Shoot. Oh boy, what's my password? Hang on a minute. You know what? I'm going to bring this one up here. This has the password. Okay, so this is our production Zeems, okay? And when you go to cluster, it is clustered. Now, the benefit of this clustering is that if I go to view junk, let's say, it is going to bring, see, we don't have any, there's no example in this particular one, but when I go to view junk, it is going to display the junks from the cluster as well as the primary, okay? And you will see this arrow in a different color when that happens. So that's what we mean by clustering in Zeems. It is not clustering of your inbox. So like I said earlier, if you right now, you cannot cluster your IMAP server. And IMAP is where the user's repository is. This clustering is just clustering of your rules. So your filtering rules, anything that you change in one is automatically going to get pushed to the other. If you read this page, it's going to talk exactly what is going to get pushed and so on and so forth. So right now, it's not clustering the IMAP or the POP. It is only clustering the rules, the filtering rules, okay? All right, any other question? Do we have any plans? We definitely have plans. We don't have an ETA yet. Now, one thing that we basically tell our customers is that there's Exchange or Zimbra or any of the the bigger email servers We don't call ourselves a competing solution to Exchange. Exchange has a lot of neat features that it can do that Zeems can't do, and vice versa, meaning there are a lot of features that Zeems had but Exchange doesn't have. So if you're using any other email system, like maybe Zimbra, I'm not sure if Zimbra also supports clustering of the IMAP, but Exchange, so we don't compete with Exchange. We say that we are a complementary solution to Exchange. If you're using Exchange and if you're using the clustering feature of Exchange, continue using that, because there are a lot of features in Zeems that Exchange does not have. And again, there are a lot of features in Exchange that Zeems did not have, okay? But yes, I mean, if we get, there's a very good chance that there could be clustering for IMAP, but right now, IMAP is not clustered. Okay, but if one, how does the mail flow through the other? Okay, so Chris is asking, but if one fails, how mail through the other? Okay, so I'm going to go back to the clustering example here. So when email come from outside, so let's say somebody, so let's assume that this is your Exchange, the box at the bottom is Exchange, right? When email comes from outside, there are altogether 3 computers and 3 different MX priorities that will handle your inbound emails. If any one of these 3 go down, the message will come from the remaining 2. If your Exchange goes down, then all 3 of these will hold messages that were being sent, and you just have to make sure that this particular server comes back, let's say about a day. A day usually is a good time, right? You have to make sure that you restore it from a backup or do whatever you need to do to restore this box. But emails that are coming from outside, they will be held at these 3 computers. When this guy comes back up, all those emails will be delivered here. Okay. All right. Gerald is asking, will the recording be available? Yes, absolutely. It will be available. It usually takes us, maybe a day or so to, compress it and clean it up and things like that. But eventually it will be available. If you go to our support link and then webinars, this is where it is going to be. If I click this right now, you will get the first webinar that we did about a month ago. All right. Okay, any other questions? No questions. All right. If there are no questions, then maybe the recording. Oh, thank you, Gerald, very much. So yeah, since there's no questions, I'm gonna say goodbye to everybody and thank you very much for joining. Have a great weekend. All right, take care. Bye.